A mother is not a servant, and no mother deserves to have a glass of orange juice thrown in her face or be screamed at by her daughter-in-law, especially not when that mother opened her home to her son and his wife, giving them everything she had, loving them with every beat of her heart. That mother is me. And today I want to share my story with all of you, because no woman should ever be humiliated in her own house. Please subscribe, like, and share this video to walk this path with me. And tell me in the comments where and when are you listening from. That morning, the dining room smelled faintly of perfume and spilled champagne. I moved slowly, gathering plates and stacking them near the sink, careful not to chip the fine china Charles and I had collected over 40 years of marriage. Across the table, Clara sat in her silk robe, scrolling on her phone, one leg crossed lazily over the other, her laughter blending with the shallow chatter of her friend beside her. Neither lifted a finger to help. When I reached for the empty juice glass, I caught a sour whiff. The orange juice had turned overnight, a thin layer of bubbles forming on the surface. Before I could clear it away, Clara wrinkled her nose. She picked up the glass, stared at me, and said loudly enough for her friend to smirk, "This juice is spoiled, just your flavor, old lady." Then she flung it across the table. Cold, sticky liquid splashed across my cheek, seeping into the collar of my blouse. For a second, no one breathed. Only the faint sound of juice dripping onto the polished wooden floor filled the silence. Her friend's laughter broke the stillness, sharp and awkward. I stood still, holding a stack of plates, my hands trembling just slightly, but I didn't speak. Years of running a household of enduring smiles that hid contempt had taught me the art of quiet control. Inside, something shifted. A low burn of humiliation mixed with a familiar sadness. I thought of the nights when Charles and I had planned this home, when respect was still part of our vocabulary. On the far wall, his portrait hung above the fireplace. Gray suit, calm eyes, that quiet authority that had once commanded boardrooms. The morning light caught the edge of his frame, making it glimmer faintly as if he were watching. I turned my gaze toward that portrait. For a moment, it felt as though Charles was silently asking me how long I planned to let this continue. My breath steadied. The humiliation cooled into something far sharper, clearer. I dabbed my cheek with the napkin, straightened the crystal glass that had rolled to the edge of the table, and said softly, "I'll take care of this." The thick, sour smell hit me before the splash did. Clara lifted the half-full glass of orange juice, her hand trembling not from guilt, but from arrogance, and threw it straight into my face. The liquid was warm and sticky, running down my neck and soaking into the collar of my blouse. For a moment, the entire dining room froze. Even the ceiling fan seemed to stop spinning. The housekeeper, poor Maria, stood near the doorway, clutching a tray, her eyes wide with horror. Clara tilted her chin, her voice sharp enough to slice through the silence. "You deserve to be thrown out with the trash. If it weren't for my father-in-law, you'd still be scrubbing floors for other people." Her friend let out a nervous laugh that died almost instantly when she realized no one else joined in. I felt the juice dripping from my chin, pooling at my collarbone. My fingers twitched, but I kept them still. I could have shouted. I could have reminded her that without me, she wouldn't be living under this roof, wearing that silk robe, dining at that table, built with my husband's hands and my sacrifices. But I didn't. Instead, I closed my eyes. In the darkness, Charles's voice came back to me as clear as if he were standing behind my shoulder. "Hazel, one day they'll forget who kept this house standing. And when that day comes, let the law remind them." When I opened my eyes again, I saw Clara's reflection in the polished cabinet glass. She looked so small, so childish, clutching her phone like a weapon she didn't know how to use. The shame she wanted me to feel no longer reached me. I took the napkin from the table, wiped my face carefully, and placed it back in perfect alignment with the plate. The more control I showed, the more her smugness began to crack. Maria whispered softly, "Ma'am, are you all right?" I nodded once and said quietly, "Please clean this up." Then I turned to leave my steps calm and even. Behind me, I could feel Clara's unease growing in the silence she had created. In my heart, I knew this wasn't over. Her insult was nothing compared to what she had truly done to my family, to my husband's name, to everything he built. I wouldn't let her destroy it with her greed and cruelty. I didn't need to raise my voice. I had something stronger on my side, patience and the law that Charles believed in. Thomas didn't say a word. He just lowered his head, pretending to scroll through his phone as if there were something urgent demanding his attention. I waited for him to look up to say anything that resembled the son I once raised, but he didn't. The silence between us was heavier than Clara's cruelty. It pressed on my chest until I could barely breathe. For years, I had told myself he was trapped, that his quietness was a form of peacekeeping, not cowardice. But that morning, as the sour smell of orange juice still lingered in the air, I saw him for what he had become, a man who found safety in silence. His father had taught him that a man's dignity isn't measured by money or titles, but by the courage to stand up for what's right. Yet here he was, sitting in the house his father built, watching his wife humiliate me without lifting a finger. He muttered something about checking an email, his thumbs moving without purpose across the screen. I could see the reflection of my own face on the black glass of his phone, old, tired, but still standing. For a moment, I thought I saw guilt flicker in his eyes, but it vanished the second Clara glanced his way. I turned away before the tears could form. Inside this $2 million mansion filled with art, imported rugs, and designer furniture, I was the only one without a place. I had built this home with Charles, chosen every brick, every window frame. Yet at 68, I had been reduced to a shadow, cleaning up after people who treated me like a burden. The irony was cruel. The true owner of the house had become its maid. The pain that once gnawed at me began to change shape. It wasn't sorrow anymore. It was clarity. His silence, that single, deliberate silence, was the final drop that overflowed the glass. It washed away every illusion I'd clung to about reconciliation or respect. I stood there looking at my son, realizing that the boy I had raised was gone. In his place was a man too weak to protect even his own mother's dignity. The hurt faded, replaced by something colder and steadier. I no longer expected him to defend me. I no longer needed him to. In that moment, I knew what Charles's voice in my memory had meant all along: when respect is gone, law must speak. I straightened my back, picked up the damp napkin from the floor, and walked toward the kitchen. Behind me, Thomas's silence followed like a ghost, a reminder that some betrayals make no sound at all. I wiped my hands slowly with the linen napkin, every movement measured, deliberate. Then I reached under the edge of the mahogany dining table, where my fingers brushed against a small, round button hidden beneath the polished wood. My husband had installed it more than 20 years ago, back when this house still felt like a fortress of pride and safety. I pressed it. The sound it made was soft, almost polite, a faint click that cut through the heavy silence. It wasn't just a button. It was a line drawn in the sand. Charles had once told me, "Hazel, this is only for emergencies, when you feel disrespected or threatened in your own home." Back then, I never imagined I would be the one to use it. Clara laughed when she heard the subtle mechanical hum that followed. She crossed her arms, rolling her eyes. "What's that supposed to be? You calling the police or just trying to scare me?" Her voice dripped with mockery. She had no idea what she had just done. Under state law, the moment she threw that glass at me, a senior citizen, and verbally attacked me in my own house, it counted as harassment. I didn't need to shout or argue. The house itself would record everything. Cameras discreetly installed years ago by Charles were already blinking red from their hidden corners. Every insult, every word, every sneer, all preserved, time-stamped, admissible. I met her gaze steadily. My heart was calm now, almost unnervingly so. That little button had changed everything. I was no longer the woman being insulted over breakfast. I was the homeowner, asserting her rights, standing inside a structure designed to protect her. She kept talking, trying to sound superior. "You think you can scare me with some antique gadget?" I smiled faintly. My voice was quiet, but firm. "You don't know whose house you're standing in." Something in the way I said it made her laughter falter. She looked around, maybe for the first time, noticing the small security panels glowing faintly near the doors, the hidden lenses in the crown molding. The walls she had treated like her stage were watching her now. Within seconds, a subtle alert pinged through the system. The security office downstairs would already be reviewing the footage. I didn't need to say another word. I straightened my shoulders, feeling a strange blend of sorrow and power. Charles's foresight was protecting me even now. The old man had always believed respect was the foundation of any home, and if that respect was ever broken, the house itself would remember who truly owned it. The sound of heavy steps came from the hallway before Clara could even finish her rant. Two security officers entered the dining room, their presence firm but professional. Less than 2 minutes had passed since I pressed the button. One of them spoke clearly, his tone calm but authoritative. "Ma'am, under the emergency directive from the property owner, you are required to leave the premises immediately. You have violated the residential conduct policy and engaged in an act of physical aggression toward a senior resident." Clara's jaw dropped. She glanced at Thomas as if he could rescue her, but his face had gone pale. She barked, "This is insane! You can't just throw me out of my own house!" The officer didn't even blink. "We're following standard procedure, ma'am. Please gather your belongings and step outside." Her voice rose to a shriek. "I want my husband here right now, Thomas. Do something." But when Thomas moved forward, another guard blocked his path. "I'm sorry, sir. For safety reasons, we have to ask you to stay where you are until the situation is cleared. It's part of the temporary safety protocol for the homeowner." The word homeowner hung in the air like a thunderclap. Clara froze, staring at me as if the word itself had betrayed her. Then she hissed, "You don't have the right to kick me out of my husband's house." I looked at her, not angry anymore, not even sad, just clear. My voice was calm when I said, "This house doesn't belong to my son." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the clock on the wall seemed to pause. Thomas looked at me, eyes wide, as if realizing something he should have known all along. I didn't need to explain. The deed had always remained in my name, never transferred, never co-owned. Charles had insisted on it for legal protection, and now his foresight had spoken louder than any argument could. Clara's face drained of color. She stammered, "You can't do this. You can't." But the guards were already at her side. Her protests turned into curses as they guided her toward the door, her heels scraping against the marble floor. When the front doors finally closed behind her, the house fell quiet again. I walked back to the table, my steps slow and steady. The broken glass lay where it had shattered, a puddle of sticky orange juice glinting in the morning light. I picked up one jagged piece, set it gently on the tray, and turned to Maria, who was still standing frozen by the wall. "Clean it up, please," I said softly. "All of it. The mess on the floor and the one that's been poisoning this home." 25 years ago, I was nobody. Just a housemaid in the Grand Mitchell estate in Connecticut, where the hallways smelled of lemon polish and old money. My days began before sunrise, setting the table, pressing shirts, recording grocery expenses in the small black ledger the head butler kept hidden in the kitchen drawer. I never gossiped, never spoke out of turn. The Mitchells were powerful people. Silence was the best kind of armor. Charles Mitchell. The head of the household was a widower known for his sharp mind and even sharper tongue. Most of the staff feared him. I didn't. Not because I was brave, but because I understood pain when I saw it. Beneath his strictness, there was a loneliness that lingered like dust in the corners no one bothered to clean. One autumn afternoon, he caught me correcting a number in the expense book that the butler had miswritten. Instead of scolding me for touching it, he studied me for a long moment and asked, "You notice everything, don't you, Hazel?" I nodded. That was the beginning of everything. When he suffered a mild stroke a year later, the others panicked, afraid of losing their positions, afraid of change. I didn't. I stayed by his side through long nights, reading his medication labels aloud, helping him walk again, cooking meals that fit his strict diet. He began to trust me more than he trusted anyone else, even his own blood. There was no grand romance at first, just companionship. Quiet dinners and the study conversations about the stock market and literature, the kind of intimacy that grows between two people who have both lost too much. Then one day, without warning, he said, "You've kept this house running better than anyone ever has. Maybe it's time you stopped working for it and started living in it." When we married, the news spread through the small, proud town like wildfire. The maid became the lady of the manor, they sneered. I still remember hearing it whispered behind fans and champagne glasses at a local charity gala. I smiled politely, as always, and said, "People only mock what they could never earn with their own dignity." Over the years, the whispers faded, replaced by reluctant respect. I learned to walk through those marble halls not as a servant, but as their rightful keeper. Yet part of me never forgot the sound of those early mornings, the clink of dishes, the rustle of curtains, the silence of being invisible. It taught me something invaluable. Power is not about where you start, but how calmly you endure before you rise. Marriage to Charles was never about luxury. It was about learning. He never treated me like a decoration beside him. On the contrary, he made sure I understood the machinery behind every decision that kept the Mitchell legacy alive. At night after dinner, we would sit in the study with the smell of oak and ink filling the air. He would hand me printed financial reports and say, "Start with the numbers, Hazel. They never lie if you know how to read them." He taught me to look beyond profits to see risks before they turned into losses. And one night, as we reviewed a contract, he told me something I've never forgotten. Never let anyone else decide your worth. That's how you lose yourself long before you lose money. Over the years, I absorbed everything he knew. I learned how to manage the family trust, how to balance investment portfolios, how to question accountants and brokers who thought an older woman wouldn't understand their jargon. Slowly, the staff and even the board began to respect me. I was no longer just the maid who married the boss. I was the woman who could sign off on deals, negotiate contracts, and detect a financial trap before anyone else noticed. Every transaction we made was transparent. We had a certified financial advisor, detailed statements, and proper documentation. Together, we expanded our real estate holdings, turning small rental properties into a steady source of income. I also established a scholarship fund under Charles's name, not for reputation, but for gratitude. Every dollar was accounted for, every signature legal and clean. It mattered to me that our fortune stood on integrity, not exploitation. Thomas Charles's only son used to call me Mom Hazel when he was younger. He was polite, even affectionate. I cooked for him, listened to his teenage complaints, helped him prepare for college interviews. But as he grew older, the whispers began. Friends and relatives from Charles's circle called me lucky, insinuating that I had married for money. Slowly, those voices replaced his own memories. I saw it in the way he stopped calling me Mom and began saying just Hazel, like a stranger. Charles sensed it too. A few months before he passed, He left me a handwritten letter, certified sealed, and stored with his will. I've read it only once, but the words are etched into me. My assets belong to you, but your honor must be protected by you alone. That sentence became my compass. After his death, I followed it faithfully. I guarded what we built, not only the property and investments, but the dignity behind them. And though people still looked at me and saw only a woman who'd married into wealth, I knew the truth. I hadn't married for comfort. I had married for partnership and learned to stand alone. The conflict didn't begin with shouting, it began with paperwork. Charles's will, drawn up under Connecticut state law, was meticulous, the kind of document only a man like him could have written. It clearly stated that I was the co-owner of all personal assets, while Thomas would inherit 47% of the company's shares. The remaining shares were divided among charitable trusts and long-term investments. The will also made one thing unshakably clear. The Mitchell estate, the house I had lived in and managed for over 2 decades, was my private property. Legally, everything was airtight. The deed carried my name, filed and notarized years before Charles's passing. My personal investment portfolio, nearly $800,000, was registered separately. Before his final hospitalization, Charles had also signed a durable power of attorney, transferring partial voting rights in the company to me, ensuring that no decision could be made without my consent. It was his way of protecting me not from the world, but from our own family. Thomas, however, didn't read the fine print. Or perhaps he chose not to. When he took over as CEO, he assumed that my presence in the house was a courtesy, not a right. I remember one morning when he came to breakfast smiling too tightly and said, "Mom, you know we could turn the mansion into a company guest house. It would make a great impression on investors." I smiled back, stirring my coffee slowly. "And where would I live, Thomas?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "We can arrange a comfortable condo downtown. You wouldn't have to worry about maintenance anymore." It was the first time I truly saw how far he had drifted from his father's values. He didn't mean cruelty. He simply saw property as numbers on a sheet. To him, legacy was a portfolio, not a home. Clara's influence didn't take long to reveal itself. Newly married, full of youthful entitlement, she began managing the household budget as if she were CFO of my life. She replaced long-term staff with cheaper hires, switched fine china for minimalist sets, and once over dinner, she smiled sweetly and said, "Mom, a woman of your age shouldn't have to deal with such a big house. There's a wonderful luxury senior residence in Hartford. You'd love it. They even have art classes." I looked at her, realizing she wasn't suggesting. She was planning. The irony was almost poetic. The same house that had once been my symbol of triumph was now the battlefield where my own family questioned my right to exist. They saw my age as weakness, my silence as consent. But what they didn't understand was that every line in Charles's will was a shield, and I knew how to wield it. I had spent years learning the language of law, finance, and inheritance. They were trying to move me out of my home, but I was the one holding the deed, and that I knew would be the beginning of their undoing. The funeral was a blur of black suits, camera flashes, and hollow condolences. I stood near the casket. My hands clasped my heart, strangely quiet. Clara clung to Thomas's arm as reporters swarmed outside the church gates. When a journalist asked about Charles's spiritual legacy, Clara smiled sweetly and answered before I could speak, saying, "Mr. Mitchell taught us all about vision and leadership. We'll honor him by continuing his work." Her words floated through the crowd like perfume, pleasant, rehearsed, and false. No one noticed that the widow said nothing at all. After the funeral, everything shifted with quiet precision. Thomas was appointed CEO of the company, as the board had long planned. Clara, young and confident, took over financial operations temporarily, or so they said. Within a few weeks, I stopped receiving meeting invitations. My name was quietly removed from the internal memos. When I asked, Thomas smiled awkwardly and said, "Mom, you've worked so hard. You deserve to rest now." Rest. That word tasted like dismissal. At home, the changes were more subtle, yet far more painful. Clara rehired the same staff I had trained years ago, but now they looked to her for orders. She began referring to me as Mrs. Mitchell in front of them, not Mom, not Hazel, as if formality could erase intimacy. One morning she handed me a clipboard and said with feigned respect, "Would you mind coordinating the cleaning schedule, Mrs. Mitchell? You know the house better than anyone." For a second, I just stared at her. The woman standing before me, polished, calculating, had turned my home into her theater. And I somehow had been recast as the help. I could have corrected her. I could have reminded her that every inch of this house, every brick and window pane bore my name. But I didn't. I took the clipboard, nodded, and said, "Of course." That night I sat in Charles's old study, the faint smell of his cologne still clinging to the leather chair. On his desk lay one of his favorite books, its spine cracked open to a line he once quoted to me. "Power is quiet until it's provoked." I ran my hand over the page and thought about how silence had become my disguise. I had mistaken it for peace, but now I saw it clearly. Silence, when tolerated too long, becomes complicity. So I decided to watch instead of speak, observe instead of react, because the wise don't need to shout to reclaim respect. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is simply waiting for everyone else to underestimate her. Thanksgiving that year was supposed to be warm and full of gratitude, but in the Mitchell household it felt more like a performance. The long dining table shimmered under the chandelier, surrounded by guests who laughed a little too loudly at Clara's jokes and poured wine as if it were courage. I sat at the end of the table, my chair slightly apart, watching the dance of pretension unfold. Halfway through dinner, Clara lifted her glass and, with that careless confidence she wore like perfume, said to her friends, "If it weren't for my father's business lessons, I'm sure Mother here would still be mopping floors somewhere." Laughter rippled through the table like broken glass. Even Thomas chuckled nervously before pretending to sip his wine, avoiding my gaze. I set my fork down gently and smiled. My voice was calm, steady, too soft to be called confrontation, too sharp to ignore. "There are people," I said, "who clean floors far better than others clean their conscience." The laughter stopped instantly. You could hear the faint crackle of the fireplace. Clara's smirk faltered for the first time that evening. I didn't need to raise my tone. Truth, when spoken quietly, echoes louder than any insult. The rest of the meal passed in awkward silence. Guests excused themselves early, pretending to have early flights or sick children. When the last car left the driveway, the house felt cavernous, echoing with all the words that hadn't been said. Thomas muttered something about stress and walked off to his study, leaving Clara glaring at me from across the room. But I didn't respond. I simply gathered the plates, my movements deliberate, measured, and left the table spotless, as if to prove my point once more. What no one knew was that I wasn't entirely alone in that house of whispers. The oldest maid, Gloria, the one I had hired 20 years ago, had started recording Clara's remarks on her phone. Not because I asked her to, but because she couldn't stand watching the cruelty unfold. She told me quietly, one night in the pantry, "Mrs. Hazel, one day, you'll need proof." Not for revenge, but for justice. I nodded. I didn't want to destroy anyone, but I also knew emotional abuse was real, and the law had words for it even when families did not. That night, after everyone went to bed, I opened my leather notebook and began writing. Dates, times, words. Every slight, every humiliation. I wasn't angry, not anymore. Anger was too loud, too obvious. What I felt was colder, cleaner purpose, because I finally understood what Charles had meant when he said the law would speak for those who stayed quiet. and I intended to let my silence do exactly that, become the most eloquent revenge of all. After Charles's death, the house changed its rhythm. Once a quiet sanctuary filled with books and the smell of fresh coffee, it became a parade ground for music, laughter, and perfume. Every Friday evening, cars lined the driveway, polished convertibles, champagne in the trunk, guests in designer gowns. Clara called them networking nights, but they were nothing more than glittering chaos. My home, the Mitchell estate, turned into a weekend circus. I moved through it like a ghost, invisible in my own house. The guests half drunk and loud whispered nicknames behind my back, the housekeeper with pearls. I heard it once, twice then, too many times to count. They found it amusing that I still wore Charles's pearls while setting the table or refilling glasses. I suppose it was easier for them to laugh than to face their own vulgarity. Clara's commands grew bolder with each party. Hazel, bring another bottle of wine. Hazel, there's a spill by the piano. Hazel, could you carry these shoes upstairs? Each order delivered with a smile that could slice glass. One night, she even handed me a towel while I was still wearing my evening dress, the same one Charles had chosen for our anniversary dinner years ago, and said, "You missed a spot near the couch." The guests laughed softly, pretending it was all harmless fun. I didn't argue. I wiped the spill, nodded politely, and left the room as if I hadn't heard the laughter. Later, I opened my leather notebook, the same one where I recorded every insult, every incident, and wrote it down carefully. Repeated acts of humiliation in front of witnesses. Evidence of emotional abuse against the homeowner. My handwriting stayed steady. Emotion had no place there, facts did. Facts. One evening, during yet another of Clara's parties, I was passing through the corridor when I overheard a careless voice from one of her friends, a young woman with too much champagne and too little tact. "So, is it true you two are transferring the house into your names for the bank loan?" The laughter that followed was loud, but Clara's quick glance toward Thomas was sharper than any sound. I froze, hidden by the doorway. So that was it. The plan behind their sudden extravagance, the reason for all those new business meetings and unexplained withdrawals. They were trying to use the property as collateral, even though it wasn't theirs to touch. I didn't confront them. Not yet. I simply walked back to my room, locked the door, and wrote another note. Attempted fraudulent transfer, overheard confirmation. That night, I sat by the window looking out at the rows of cars parked beneath the oaks, their headlights fading into the dark. My house was being used, my kindness exploited, my name mocked. But I didn't feel rage, only precision. Every word they spoke, every act they committed, was a thread weaving their own downfall. And I was patiently recording the pattern. After Charles passed, the house lost its rhythm. The quiet dignity it once held turned into noise and perfume and laughter that didn't belong. Every weekend, the Mitchell mansion became a playground for Thomas and Clara's social circle, young executives, influencers, and trust fund heirs who drank too much and spoke too loudly. They walked through the hallways as if they owned them, brushing against portraits of my late husband without so much as a glance. Someone once pointed at me pearls around my neck and laughed, "Oh, the housekeeper wears jewelry here. How fancy." The others joined in, wine glasses clinking. I smiled politely, the way I used to when I was still a servant, only this time I wasn't one. Clara's commands grew bolder with each passing week. "Hazel, bring more wine to the patio," she'd say, without even looking at me. Or, "Can you clean up the spill in the living room? Be careful, that rug cost a fortune." Once she dropped a pair of her friend's high heels in front of me and chirped, "Would you mind taking these upstairs? You're closer to the stairs anyway." I looked at her, then at the shoes, and simply nodded. I didn't need to argue. I had started documenting everything. In the evenings, when the last car left the driveway and the echoes of laughter faded, I would sit at my desk in the small study Charles once called his thinking room. I opened my leather notebook and wrote down every detail, time, date, witnesses, and words. Emotional and social abuse against the homeowner. I titled each entry precisely. To anyone else, it might have seemed obsessive. But to me, it was discipline, the kind Charles taught me, the kind that turned humiliation into strategy. One Saturday night during yet another party, I stood by the hallway with a tray of champagne glasses. The music was loud, the air thick with perfume and money. Clara's friends were gossiping near the piano, their laughter spilling over like the drinks they kept refilling. Then one of them, a woman in a glittering silver dress, leaned in and said too loudly for her own good, I heard they're transferring the house title to both their names next week to get a better bank loan. My hand froze around the stem of a glass. I didn't look up, didn't say a word. I simply turned, set the tray down, and walked away quietly. In the reflection of the window, I saw Thomas nodding nervously while Clara whispered something in his ear. The pieces finally fit together. They weren't just disrespecting me, they were planning something illegal. But I didn't confront them. Not yet. I closed my notebook that night and looked at the old family crest engraved on the cover. For the first time in years, I felt the calm that comes before a storm. Because when people believe you're powerless, they forget to lower their voices. And that's when they tell you everything you need to destroy them. It started with something as small as a dress, a misunderstanding that revealed everything that had been festering beneath the surface. One evening, the new maid accidentally folded Clara's Chanel gown into my closet. I didn't notice. I had long stopped caring about fashion or labels. But near midnight, my bedroom door flew open with a bang. Clara stood there, her hair disheveled, her voice slicing through the dark. You took my dress, didn't you? My Chanel. For a second, I thought she was joking. Then I saw her eyes, sharp, venomous, certain. I rose slowly from my chair, still holding the book I had been reading. If it's in my closet, the maid must have misplaced it, I said quietly. But she was already storming across the room, yanking open the wardrobe. The black silk dress hung neatly among my cardigans. Clara snatched it off the hanger as if pulling out proof of a crime. You really don't know when to stop pretending. Do you? She spat, clutching the gown. Before I could respond, she raised her phone, snapped a photo, and left. The next thing I knew, my phone buzzed with notifications. She had posted the picture in the family group chat with the caption, "The old lady can't let go of her servant habits, stealing what isn't hers." The words burned more than the accusation itself. Within seconds, relatives reacted with shocked emojis and pitying comments. And then came Thomas's message. Just one line. Mom, please don't embarrass me anymore. I sat there, the phone heavy in my hand, staring at those words until they blurred. There it was, the quiet betrayal I had feared most. Not from enemies, but from my own child. I felt something in me harden, not with anger, but with clarity. I printed the chat thread that night, every line, every timestamp. I saved the screenshots in a folder marked Evidence. My lawyer's words from years ago echoed in my memory. False accusation against a senior citizen, if done publicly, can be considered defamation and harassment under state law. I never thought I'd need that knowledge. But now it was armor. When the house fell silent, I stood in front of the mirror, still in my nightgown, and looked at the reflection of a woman they thought was powerless. The insult had stung, but it had also done something else. It had awakened a precision I hadn't felt in years. They wanted to humiliate me, but they had handed me proof instead. From that night on, I began documenting everything, every insult, every message, every word spoken in anger. Not for revenge, but for justice. Because sometimes, humiliation isn't the end of dignity. It's the beginning of a plan. I asked Thomas to meet me one afternoon, just the two of us. The house was quiet sunlight, filtering through the tall windows onto the marble floor. I poured him a cup of tea the way I always used to when he was a boy, hoping the warmth might soften the distance between us. "Thomas," I said gently, "I know Clara means well, but lately she's been difficult. The things she says, they're not jokes anymore." He didn't look up. His fingers drummed lightly on the table, his phone face down beside the teacup. "Mom," he said, forcing a small laugh, "you're taking it too seriously. She jokes like that with everyone. You just have to ignore it." I watched him carefully, noticing the small tremor in his voice, the way his eyes flickered toward the doorway, as if afraid someone might overhear. It wasn't fear of confrontation. It was fear of losing control. Fear of cracking the image of a perfect family he had been so eager to display to the world. My son wasn't protecting me. He was protecting the illusion. I nodded slowly, pretending to accept his words, though my chest felt hollow. "I see," I whispered. "So she's joking." He smiled in relief, mistaking my calm for agreement. I let him believe it. A few days later, I received a bank notification, a small withdrawal, then another and another. The account was the household maintenance fund Charles and I had established years ago. It was still under my name, but Thomas and Clara had access for home expenses. When I checked the transaction details, the recipient was listed under Clara's personal card. Thousands of dollars redirected not to repairs or staff salaries, but to boutiques, restaurants, and something labeled consulting services. My hands tightened around the paper statement. The betrayal was no longer emotional. It was financial, deliberate, legal. They were bleeding me slowly, hiding behind charm and civility. That night, I stood by the window looking out at the dark garden Charles had once tended himself. The hydrangeas were blooming, but the air felt heavy. I thought of my son, the little boy who used to pick flowers and bring them to me after school. And I wondered, when had love turned into obligation, and obligation into contempt? I realized then that I wasn't just being disrespected, I was being erased. Quietly, politely, efficiently. They didn't see me as family anymore. I had become an inconvenience, a line item to be managed, a burden to be removed when convenient. And for the first time, I didn't feel sorrow. I felt clarity. Because once you understand that love has been replaced by strategy, you stop waiting for apologies and start preparing for consequences. The splash was cold and sour, hitting my face before I even realized what was happening. The orange juice, spoiled and sticky, ran down my neck, soaking into the collar of my blouse. The room froze. Clara stood a few feet away, her chest heaving, the empty glass trembling in her hand. The silence that followed was louder than the insult itself. Even the ticking clock seemed to stop. I didn't move right away. I could feel every drop sliding down my skin, smell the acidic rot of something once sweet. I expected anger to rise, or humiliation, or pain, but instead, I felt nothing but clarity. It was as if all the years of patience, all the layers of silence and civility had finally stripped away. Everything I needed to know about the people standing before me was now plain as day. Clara's smirk faltered when I met her eyes. She expected me to shout to defend myself, to prove she'd gotten under my skin. Instead, I simply dabbed my face with a napkin, slow and calm. "Are you finished?" I asked softly. My voice didn't shake. That somehow frightened her more than any raised tone could have. She stepped back slightly, the mockery in her eyes replaced by something closer to unease. Thomas looked from her to me. Frozen lips parted, as if he might finally say something, but nothing came. His silence was a choice, and it echoed louder than Clara's cruelty. I turned away, not to hide my face, but to breathe. My fingers brushed against the edge of the dining table, the same one where Charles and I used to share breakfast and plans for the future. And then, almost instinctively, my gaze flicked toward the far corner of the room, where a small black dot blinked faintly red. The camera. Months ago, after the first time Clara accidentally shoved me in the hallway, I had installed it discreetly for my own safety. She had mocked me for being paranoid, but I left it there, quietly watching. And now it had captured everything, every word, every drop of spoiled juice, every sneer. I smoothed the napkin on the table and looked at her once more. "You should get some rest, Clara," I said evenly. "You look unsettled." Then I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing in the silence she had created. Behind me, the faint click of the camera continued recording, preserving. It wasn't revenge, I felt, not yet. It was precision. Because sometimes, justice doesn't begin with a scream. It begins with a single quiet moment and proof that cannot be denied. I wiped my face slowly with the edge of the linen napkin, each motion calm and deliberate. The sour stickiness of the orange juice clung to my skin, but my heartbeat had already steadied. Clara was still standing across the table, arms crossed, smirking as if she had just proven something. I looked at her, really looked at her. The arrogance, the lack of restraint, the blind belief that youth and cruelty made her powerful. Then I folded the napkin neatly, placed it back on the table, and said softly, "Thank you, my dear. You've just shown me everything I needed to see." Before she could respond, I reached under the dining table. My fingers found the small metal button embedded beneath the mahogany, the one Charles had installed more than 20 years ago for emergencies. I pressed it. The sound was barely audible, a soft click that cut through the silence like a promise. Clara laughed. "Oh, don't tell me you're pressing a panic button now," she sneered. "What are you going to do, call the police because I hurt your feelings?" Her voice dripped with mockery. She thought it was a game, an old woman's dramatic attempt to reclaim control. But within seconds, a faint alarm tone echoed from the hallway, followed by the distant sound of footsteps. 2 security officers appeared at the door, professionals from the private firm that still worked under the estate's long-standing contract. Their presence changed the temperature in the room. "Mrs. Mitchell," one of them said respectfully, "we received a distress signal. Is everything all right?" I gestured toward Clara without raising my voice. "Please record her statement and document what just happened. This incident falls under elder abuse protocol." Clara blinked, the color draining from her face. "Elder abuse," she repeated, her voice cracking into a laugh that no longer sounded confident. "This is ridiculous. I didn't hurt her. We were just—" The officer interrupted calmly. "Ma'am, any form of physical aggression or verbal insult toward a resident over 65 must be documented. The footage from the security cameras will be reviewed." For a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the system recording every word. Thomas stood frozen near the doorway, his expression unreadable. Clara's smile had vanished completely. I looked at the officers, then at her, and said gently, "You should leave now. The rest will be handled properly." She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The arrogance, the laughter, all of it dissolved into a stunned silence. The same house she had treated like her stage was now turning against her, bound by the laws she thought didn't apply. As the officers escorted her out, I sat back down, folded my hands, and exhaled slowly. The air felt clean again. The plan had begun quiet, lawful, unstoppable. Clara's confidence returned quickly after the security officers left. Within hours, she and Thomas were on the phone with a lawyer, pacing around the living room as if they owned the place. I could hear their voices from upstairs, Clara sharp and commanding, Thomas quieter, hesitant, but obedient. They spoke about legal options, inheritance rights, and removing an occupant. To them, I was no longer a mother or even a person. I was an obstacle. By the end of the week, they sent me a formal notice typed and full of arrogance, demanding that I vacate the property belonging to the Mitchell estate. I didn't respond. I simply forwarded the letter to my attorney, Maya Wells. Charles had chosen her years ago, young, brilliant, and utterly unshakable. When I called, she only said, "Mrs. Mitchell, I've been waiting for this day. The meeting took place 2 days later in the grand dining room, the same one where Clara had thrown the orange juice. Thomas stood beside his wife, trying to look composed, while Clara smirked, pretending to adjust her pearl earrings. "We'll settle this quickly," she said. "This house belongs to my husband's family. You've overstayed your welcome." Before I could speak, Maya arrived. Her heels clicked confidently against the marble floor. Clara's expression faltered the moment she recognized her. They had met once at a charity gala, where Maya had declined Clara's offer to collaborate on an investment. Now the same woman stood beside me, opening a sleek folder. "Mrs. Mitchell's ownership is not in dispute," Maya said, laying down the official documents. "Under the will of the late Mr. Charles Mitchell, notarized and recorded under Connecticut law, this residence and all personal assets fall solely under Hazel Mitchell's name." The color drained from Clara's face. "That can't be right," she snapped. "Thomas inherited the company." "Yes," Maya replied evenly. 47% of the company's shares, not the estate, not the house, not the personal accounts. You are currently residing here by her permission, which she closed the folder neatly, can be revoked at any time. I folded my hands, my voice calm but firm. "This isn't your home being taken away," I said softly. "It's my home, and I'm asking my guests to leave." Clara's composure shattered. She lunged forward, grabbing the papers, and tore them in half. The sound of ripping echoed through the room. Maya didn't flinch. She only pointed toward the corner of the ceiling where the small security camera blinked red. "Ma'am," she said calmly, "you might want to remember that this room is under surveillance. Any act of aggression or property damage will be submitted directly to the court." Clara froze her hands, trembling over the shredded papers. The realization sank in. This was no longer a family argument. It was a legal battlefield, and she had already lost the first war. I stood up, straightened my blouse, and looked at her with the quiet authority Charles once carried. "Now," I said, "let's make sure the door is open for them." The morning after the confrontation, I didn't stay home. Instead, I dressed carefully, a charcoal gray suit Charles had once insisted made me look too professional for retirement, and drove into the city. The plaque on the glass door read, "Wells and Carter, Attorneys at Law." The office smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish, and behind a desk, stacked with files, sat Maya Wells, the same young woman who had stood by my side days earlier, steady and composed. "Mrs. Mitchell," she greeted, standing to shake my hand. "I was hoping you'd come." I didn't sit like a client seeking sympathy. I sat like someone preparing a briefing. I told her everything: the orange juice, the threats, the financial irregularities I'd begun to notice. I didn't cry, and I didn't soften my words. When I finished, Maya nodded slowly, her sharp eyes flickering with both anger and admiration. "This isn't just family conflict," she said. "It's financial elder abuse dressed up as family management." She turned to her computer, pulling up corporate records from the Mitchell Group's trust holdings. As she scrolled through the documents, her expression changed. "Did you know," she asked, "that you're still listed as co-owner of an investment fund under the company's portfolio?" I frowned. "That fund was set up years ago. Charles managed it." "He did," she confirmed, "but he also designated you as equal partner before he passed. The fund's current value is about $1.2 million, and according to Connecticut trust law, you have full legal authority to withdraw or freeze it." For a moment, the number meant nothing to me. What struck me harder was the realization that the company Thomas now led, the one he and Clara flaunted as their success, still ran on assets built and protected by Charles and me. It wasn't theirs. It never had been. Maya leaned forward, her tone careful but deliberate. "Hazel, I suggest we move the funds, not out of revenge but strategy. When the money leaves, people reveal who they really are. I understood instantly. It wasn't about taking anything from them. It was about exposing the truth. People can pretend affection when wealth flows their way, but when it stops, their real loyalty surfaces. We drafted the withdrawal documents that same afternoon. Maya explained every clause, every safeguard. It was a clean, lawful act, one that would quietly shift control back to me. As I signed the final page, she smiled faintly. "You're not just defending yourself," she said. "You're setting a trap, one only patience can spring." Driving home, I felt no triumph, only calm. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting. I was leading. Clara and Thomas thought they had stripped me of power, but soon they'd learn the truth. Charles had always known control doesn't come from shouting or fear. It comes from knowing when to move and when to make others watch what happens next. I didn't need to confront them to know what was happening. I only needed to listen. Through a trusted financial advisor, a man who had once handled Charles's corporate audits, I quietly obtained updates about Mitchell Interiors. The numbers told their own story. Thomas had leveraged his shares in the company as collateral for a private bank loan, a direct violation of the fiduciary agreement his father had established. That contract explicitly prohibited any personal use of corporate equity for private borrowing. He had broken one of Charles's oldest rules: never gamble with what belongs to others. But Thomas didn't act alone. Clara's signature appeared on the falsified accounting documents, neatly typed, her handwriting, elegant, even in deceit. She had helped inflate the value of the company's fixed assets, making it appear more solvent than it truly was. The goal was simple: to secure approval for the loan that would cover their mounting lifestyle expenses. New cars, a vacation property, designer furniture, all funded by the illusion of wealth. When I saw the photocopies, I didn't feel anger. I felt confirmation. Their downfall was no longer a possibility. It was a process. I stored the documents carefully in a folder and called Maya. "Keep these sealed for now," I told her. "They'll reveal themselves when the time is right." Maya agreed, her tone composed, but cold. "This isn't just mismanagement, Hazel. It's corporate fraud. Once the board knows, they'll lose everything." "Not yet," I said. "They're still writing their own confession." And as if on cue, it arrived sooner than expected. During an internal meeting at the company, Thomas and Clara's perfect facade cracked. A junior accountant, nervous and tired of taking orders, recorded the entire argument on his phone. Later that evening, I received the audio file anonymously through email. Thomas's voice came first, frustrated and defensive. "You forged the numbers, Clara. Do you realize what you've done?" Her reply was sharp, laced with venom. "If your mother hadn't pulled the funds, I wouldn't have had to fake anything. Don't you dare blame me for cleaning up your mess." Silence followed, then a faint sound, perhaps the weight of truth, finally sinking in. I played the recording twice, then saved it carefully in my private archive. The evidence was no longer mine to seek. They were handing it to me piece by piece out of desperation and pride. That night I opened my journal and wrote only one line. Sometimes liars confess not by guilt, but by trying too hard to justify themselves. I closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and smiled faintly in the dark. The truth didn't need my voice anymore. It was speaking perfectly well without me. The house smelled of lemon polish and quiet anticipation. For the first time in years, the Mitchell mansion looked the way it used to: dignified, symmetrical, unbothered by chaos. I walked slowly through the great room as the staff finished setting up the chairs, my hand brushing over the polished banister Charles once leaned on when explaining his business principles to young associates. He had always said, "You don't destroy arrogance with anger. You destroy it with facts in public." Today, I intended to prove him right. Maya and I had spent days preparing. Instead of filing lawsuits or pressing criminal charges, which would drag on for months, we planned something sharper, cleaner. A shareholder meeting held not in an office or courtroom, but in my living room. The letter of invitation, written in formal but neutral language, had gone out to every stakeholder of Mitchell Interiors. It read, "Informal gathering to clarify rights and obligations under the will of Charles Mitchell." That line alone was enough to make Thomas panic and Clara furious. Still, they couldn't refuse. Maya had reminded them in her signature calm tone that under Connecticut state law, an heir or co-owner has the legal right to host a meeting on estate property if there are allegations of mismanagement. Failure to attend could classify them as non-cooperative shareholders, a detail that would not sit well with the board or future investors. By the morning of the meeting, the house had transformed into a stage. The long oak table gleamed under the chandelier. On its surface, we arranged copies of share certificates, transfer deeds, and an updated ledger of company assets. A small projector sat at the end, waiting to display the financial inconsistencies Maya had uncovered. And beside it, framed photos of Charles in his prime standing in front of the first Mitchell Interiors storefront, shaking hands with employees, smiling with quiet pride. "This isn't revenge," I told Maya as she checked the microphone setup. "It's education." She smiled slightly. Education can sting worse than punishment. When the guests began arriving, shareholders, former advisors, even a few longtime friends of Charles the heir thickened with curiosity. Thomas entered last, face pale but jaw tight. Clara followed overdressed and tense, her perfume cutting through the air like arrogance disguised as roses. I greeted them with perfect calm. "Welcome home," I said simply, motioning toward the table. "Please take your seats. We'll begin once everyone's here." Maya took her place beside me, her folder stacked neatly, her tone precise as she began the introduction. "As counsel for Mrs. Mitchell, I would like to remind all present that this gathering complies fully with state estate law. All discussions will be recorded for transparency." Clara's eyes darted to the camera on the mantelpiece. Thomas shifted in his chair. They thought they were walking into a conversation. What they didn't realize was that they had stepped into a courtroom, one built of memory evidence and their own mistakes. The meeting began late because Thomas and Clara, as always, needed to make an entrance. They swept into the room 15 minutes after the appointed time. Clara in a cream suit too bright for the occasion, Thomas in the same gray tie he wore to every crisis. They sat opposite me, whispering to each other, the arrogance in their posture as deliberate as the smirk that played on Clara's lips. But I didn't move. I sat at the head of the table, calm, composed every inch, the woman who knew this house, and the truth belonged to her. Maya opened the session with quiet authority. Before we discuss future management, she said it's important we revisit the company's origins. She switched on the small projector. A series of scanned documents appeared on the screen, yellowed papers with ink faded but still legible. "These," Maya continued, "are the original incorporation files of Mitchell Interiors, dated 25 years ago. At that time, the company was registered under two founding partners, Mr. Charles Mitchell and Mrs. Hazel Mitchell." A soft murmur rippled through the room. On the wall, enlarged by the light, were the signatures, Charles's strong strokes and mine, smaller but steady, side by side. Below them, a financial record outlined my role, bookkeeping, operational management, and seed capital contribution from my personal savings, the same savings I had built when I was still a domestic worker in another household. I watched Clara's face drain of color as she stared at the screen. For years, she had laughed at my story, calling me the maid who got lucky. But luck doesn't sign founding documents, and luck doesn't fund the first inventory of a design firm. Her mouth opened slightly, as if to argue, then closed again when she realized there was nothing left to say. Maya turned off the projector. "These records are legally certified," she said evenly. "They confirm that Mrs. Mitchell was a co-founder, not an employee. Her ownership and her legacy are both a matter of public record." The silence that followed felt heavy, like the air before a storm. I could see Thomas avoiding my gaze, staring instead at the table as though he could disappear into it. He had inherited his father's name, but not his father's integrity. I stood up slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. My voice was quiet, but it carried through every corner of the room. "I'm not here to demand repayment," I said. "I don't need anyone to return the money I earned. I only want one thing, the very thing you threw away." I looked from Thomas to Clara, my eyes steady. Respect. The word hung in the air like a bell that would not stop ringing. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the ticking of the old clock seemed to hesitate. For the first time in years, I felt the house itself side with me, the walls, the portraits, the history. And in the silence that followed, I could almost feel the wind shifting. Karma, patient and precise, was finally on its way. That morning, the mansion didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a courtroom disguised as elegance. The air was still sharpened by quiet purpose. I had woken early, dressed in a gray wool suit that Charles had once chosen for me, simple, timeless, commanding without excess. My hair was pinned neatly, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw not a victim, not even a widow, but the rightful owner of her legacy preparing for trial. Downstairs, the living room had been transformed. The long oak table stood polished to a sheen, the same table where family dinners had once taken place. Now it bore a different kind of weight rows of sealed folders, legal binders, and at the center, a single envelope in Charles's handwriting. His last letter. I placed it there myself, right under the light like a compass for what was to come. By 10 o'clock, the guests began to arrive. Shareholders, board members, 2 reporters from the local business journal, and Maya Sharp, as always, carrying her laptop and calm authority. Then came a man in a navy suit, briefcase in hand. Thomas and Clara didn't recognize him, but I did. He was an official from the Connecticut Department of Financial Regulation, the quiet observer Maya had arranged to attend under legal pretext. Thomas looked uneasy, tugging at his tie. "What's going on here, Mom?" This was supposed to be an internal review. I smiled faintly. It is, dear. Internal and official. Clara's heels clicked impatiently across the floor as she whispered something under her breath. She had chosen a white blazer, as if purity could be worn. Maya began setting up the projector, her expression unreadable. When everyone had settled, I gestured for silence. "This meeting," I said, "is not about revenge. It's about truth and record." My voice was calm, but even I could hear the steel beneath it. Maya clicked the first slide, company emails correspondence between Clara and an investment broker. The tone was casual, but the content was damning proof of falsified statements and asset manipulation. The official from the department took quiet notes. Clara's face paled. "Those emails are private," she snapped. "Not when they concern corporate fraud," Maya replied smoothly, "and not when they're already part of a federal audit." Thomas tried to interject, but Maya continued pulling out a printed message. "This, for example, is one of yours, Mrs. Mitchell." She read it aloud. "Once Hazel's out of the picture, we'll have full control. I just need you to sign the adjusted reports." The room went silent. You could hear the faint hum of the projector. I didn't look at her immediately. Instead, I opened Charles's envelope and unfolded the letter, reading aloud his words, "Hazel, if the day ever comes when those you helped forget who you are, remind them not with anger, but with evidence." When I looked up, Clara's mask had cracked. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that Maya had already sent copies of those emails to the police the night before. A warrant was ready, waiting for the final confirmation, her own admission. And as she opened her mouth to defend herself, shouting that it wasn't a crime, "Just business," I saw the official quietly stand, signaling to the 2 plainclothes officers at the back. The wheels of karma were already in motion. The moment the meeting began, Thomas's composure cracked. His voice trembled before he even finished his first sentence. "Mom?" he said, his tone halfway between desperation and shame. "Please, Please don't go through with selling the shares. I'll fix everything. I promise. His hands were clasped together like a man praying for mercy, but his eyes darted toward the shareholders, terrified that they were watching the empire he'd built unravel. I looked at him for the long moment before replying. A company, I said slowly, cannot survive if those running it have no integrity. You should thank me, Thomas. I'm not destroying what you built. I'm saving it from collapsing under the weight of your lies. The words landed heavy in the room. Even the ticking of the clock seemed to pause. For a moment, I almost saw the boy he used to be, the one who once brought me flowers from the garden and promised he'd make his father proud. But that boy was long gone, buried under fear and pride. Then Clara's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Oh, please," she scoffed, leaning back in her chair. "Let's not pretend you're some savior, Hazel. If it weren't for me, this family would still be stuck in the past. I'm the one who brought Mitchell Interiors into the modern age, the brand, the clients, the recognition, that's me." Maya glanced up from her notes, expression unreadable, while several shareholders shifted uncomfortably. Clara's voice kept rising, fueled by the arrogance that always made her believe she was untouchable. "Without me," she went on, "this company would be forgotten. You should be grateful I made your husband's name worth something again." I didn't answer right away. I let her words hang in the air, every syllable digging her own grave. Around the table, eyes widened, whispers began. You could see the realization dawning on people's faces. This wasn't confidence. It was delusion. Thomas turned toward her, panic in his eyes. "Clara, stop." But she ignored him. "You all think I did something wrong?" she continued, gesturing dramatically toward the investors. "But I've built more in 5 years than the rest of you did in 20. This company needs me." That was the moment the illusion shattered. The woman who had once strutted through charity galas and magazine interviews, parading as the visionary behind the Mitchell legacy, now looked like exactly what she was: desperate, reckless, and drunk on her own ego. I folded my hands and looked at her calmly. "You've mistaken control for contribution," I said softly. "But power without principle doesn't last, and arrogance," I paused, letting my eyes meet hers, "is always the prelude to ruin." Her face stiffened. The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't fear that filled it. It was anticipation. Everyone could feel what was coming. Clara thought she was invincible. She didn't know the ground beneath her was already giving way. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. My palms rested on the polished oak table, the same table where Clara once mocked me for being too sentimental to lead. Now it was her turn to feel what it was like to be stripped of control. Without a word, I reached for the remote and pressed the button. The projector flickered to life, casting a pale glow across the wall. On the screen appeared a title in bold white letters: "Confidential, Riverside Project." A ripple of confusion spread through the room. Clara froze, her confident smile faltering for the first time. I could almost hear her heartbeat in the silence. Then came the first slide, an email chain, her email addressed to Morgan Capital Bank, Offshore Division. The text was clear and undeniable. She had authorized a temporary transfer of project funds to an external account listed under the name Clara Avery Mitchell. Maya's voice cut through the tension, steady and professional. "Attachment." She read offshore account details. "Beneficiary Clara Avery Mitchell, Cayman Islands." A collective gasp filled the room. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. One of the older shareholders shot up from his seat, his voice trembling with outrage. "This is embezzlement. She's using the company to launder money." The man from the Connecticut Department of Financial Regulation, the quiet observer at the back, began taking notes, his expression unreadable. Clara's eyes darted around the room, searching for Thomas, but even he couldn't look at her. "You can't prove that," she snapped, her voice cracking. "That's private correspondence." Maya turned toward her, calm as ever. "Actually, we can." The account was flagged by FinCEN's automated reporting system under the Bank Secrecy Act. The trail is fully traceable, time-stamped and authenticated. Your transactions match the criteria under U.S. Code, bar 1956, money laundering. The words landed like a gavel. There was no more noise, no more pretense. Just the soft hum of the projector, the reflection of Clara's own name glowing on the screen, the evidence she could never talk her way out of. Her face turned ashen. She reached for Thomas's arm, but he pulled away, staring at the documents in disbelief. "You told me it was a routine transfer," he whispered. Clara opened her mouth to reply, but nothing came out. Her confidence, that relentless arrogance, had turned into sheer panic. Around the room, murmurs swelled. "She's finished. It's over." I looked at her not with anger, but with something colder certainty. "You once said I didn't understand modern business," I said quietly. "But it seems I understand ethics better than you ever will." The projector light flickered, illuminating her trembling hands as Maya closed the file. The sound of pens scribbling documents being stamped and chairs shifting filled the silence. The court of public judgment had begun, and this time there was no escape. Clara's face went pale, her breath shallow, like someone realizing the walls around her were closing in. "No," she stammered, her voice cracking under pressure. "No, I did it for the company. Everything I did was for us." Her words tumbled out desperate, incoherent, but Maya was already clicking through to the next slide. The screen changed again, another email thread. The subject line read, "Private Arrangement Riverside Sale." This time the message was undeniable. Clara's own words appeared in black and white for everyone to see. "We'll split 30-70 after the shares are sold." He doesn't have to know. Gasps echoed around the room. Thomas pressed both hands to his forehead, the color draining from his face. "Oh, God, Clara," he whispered, his voice hollow. In that single moment, every illusion he'd built his career, his pride, his image of control crumbled into dust. The room felt smaller, suffocating. Clara tried to speak, but her voice trembled. "Thomas, it's not what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like." Maya cut in quietly, her tone almost merciful. "The evidence speaks for itself. I didn't move. I just looked at my son, not with anger, but with the weight of a mother watching her last thread of faith snap." "Perhaps you forgot," I said softly. "This company was built on honesty, not greed." The silence that followed was unbearable. Thomas's shoulders collapsed inward, his eyes filled with regret, not only for what Clara had done, but for every time he'd chosen to stay silent when I needed him most. And for the first time that day, I felt tears form, not hot with rage, but cold with finality. They slid down my cheeks slowly without resistance. It wasn't vengeance that hurt me now. It was the realization that somewhere along the years I had lost my son, long before I lost the company. The faint whir of the projector stopped. Then came the sound of chairs shifting, papers rustling, and footsteps. Clara suddenly stood up, clutching her bag. "I'm done with this farce," she yelled, heading toward the door. Before she could take 2 steps, the front doors opened. 2 uniformed officers entered, followed by a woman in a navy jacket displaying the seal of the Department of Financial Crimes. The taller officer spoke firmly. "Mrs. Clara Avery Mitchell, you are under arrest for fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of financial reporting. Please place your hands where I can see them." Clara froze, her body stiff as the handcuffs clicked shut. The irony was bitter. She was being arrested in the same room where she had once humiliated me. Maya stepped forward, her tone composed. "Mrs. Hazel, thank you for your cooperation in providing the documentation. This will be pursued as a full federal case." Outside, camera flashes burst through the front windows. Within hours, headlines were already spreading. "Wife of CEO arrested in financial fraud scandal at family mansion." And as I stood there in silence, I didn't smile, didn't gloat. I simply exhaled. Justice had arrived quietly, precisely in the very house where cruelty had once ruled. Karma didn't take long to arrive. Within weeks, the headlines shifted from business accolades to scandalous disgrace. Former CFO Clara Avery Mitchell indicted for fraud and money laundering, the words blared across newspapers and online feeds. Her photo, once used in glossy magazines, spreads about modern women in leadership, now showed her in handcuffs, eyes hollow, makeup smeared. The charges were severe financial fraud, corporate embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. Clara was removed immediately from her position as chief financial officer. Every asset she had, from her luxury cars to her so-called consulting accounts, was frozen pending trial. Thomas's fall was quieter, but just as brutal. The board voted unanimously to suspend him as CEO, citing failure of oversight and ethical negligence. His shares were frozen under judicial review, and he was barred from representing the company in any capacity. Overnight, Mitchell Interiors, once a respected family brand, became a symbol of internal corruption. The media devoured the story. One article read, "Once the pride of Connecticut's elite, now torn apart by greed." Another detailed the company's restructuring under emergency supervision, with new independent directors appointed to oversee all financial activity. Reporters waited outside the courthouse every morning, eager to capture new footage of the once glamorous couple now shrouded in humiliation. Through it all, I remained silent. I granted no interviews, issued no statements, and accepted no praise. The world saw a scandal. I saw a cleansing. Quietly, I met with Maya and arranged to transfer a large portion of my personal funds, the same capital Clara had tried to steal, into a charitable trust under Charles's name, the Charles Mitchell Foundation for Integrity and Education. This way, I told Maya, the Mitchell name will stand for something pure again. She nodded, her eyes soft. "He'd be proud of you, Mrs. Mitchell." The day Clara's trial began, reporters gathered at the courthouse steps. She appeared in a beige prison uniform, wrists bound, her hair tied back in a plain knot. The arrogance that had once defined her was gone. Cameras clicked mercilessly, capturing her every faltering step. Across town, I sat in the Garden Cafe outside Maya's office, dressed in my gray suit, sipping tea as the autumn breeze brushed through my hair. When Maya joined me with the latest updates, I smiled faintly. "Everything happens as it should," I said. "Some lessons take years to mature, but they always bloom when the time is right." Maya smiled. "And some roots," she added, "can only grow after the weeds are gone." I looked out toward the skyline, the city that had once whispered about the maid who became a wife and felt nothing but peace. Karma had done its work. The family's honor was restored not through vengeance but through truth. The morning light poured gently across the porch, painting everything in soft gold. The air smelled of jasmine and fresh rain, and for the first time in years the house felt quiet, not empty but peaceful. I sat with a cup of tea between my hands, the steam curling like breath from a calm soul. The birds were louder now, as if they too sensed that the storm had passed. I opened my old leather-bound journal, its pages already filled with the fragments of a life rebuilt. The pen moved slowly as I wrote the day. Clara threw that glass of spoiled orange juice at me was the same day I washed this house clean of its shame. I paused, watching sunlight dance across the rim of my teacup. How strange it was that pain once so unbearable could become a kind of clarity. I realized that every humiliation, every cruel word had been chiseling away, not at my dignity, but at the illusions around me. And now all that was left was truth. When a neighbor stopped by later that morning, she asked gently, "Do you ever regret what happened?" I smiled, not bitterly, just with the kind of acceptance that only comes from surviving too much. "No," I said. "I only regret teaching them how to make money without teaching them how to be human." She didn't know how to respond. Few people do when faced with honesty, stripped of anger. I handed her a cookie from the tin beside me and said, "We all learn some lessons, just come too late." The breeze shifted, carrying the faint chime of the wind bells Charles had hung decades ago. I looked toward the garden where lavender had begun to bloom again. For a long time, I thought that growing old meant losing power. But now I understood it meant seeing too much to be afraid anymore. As the camera in Maya's team recorded a short interview for the Foundation's anniversary, my voice played over the footage of the house, the garden, the calm morning. Old age isn't weakness, it's wisdom sharpened by pain. The video ended with the Foundation's message and my final words spoken not as a warning, but as a call from the heart. If you've ever felt your kindness used against you, share your story not for pity, but for strength. Someone out there needs to know that dignity can be reclaimed, that justice can bloom quietly even after betrayal.